She became an internet and television celebrity right before her death this weekend. She said her goal was to begin a national conversation about how we handle the end of life. And true to her word, on Saturday, Brittany Maynard took her own life using medicine legally prescribed to her by a doctor. She was only 29 years old. She had terminal brain cancer. And the conversation she started indeed goes on. Our report tonight from our national correspondent, Kate Snow.
I hope my family is still proud of me and the choices I made.
Brittany Maynard made an enormously difficult choice in an enormously public way. In this video posted by an advocacy group last week, she worried the seizures she was having would leave her incapable of making her own decision if she waited too long.
I remember looking at my husband's face at one point and thinking, I know this is my husband, but I can't say his name.
She and her family had moved to Oregon specifically because the state allows doctors to prescribe life-ending drugs.
I would like to see all Americans have access to the same healthcare rights.
The 29-year-old's death has reframed a debate defined for so many years by Jack Kevorkian, the man Time magazine called Dr. Death.
He scared people. He was almost like the wild-eyed fanatic. Brittany, she's young, she's articulate, she doesn't frighten anyone, and she's saying, I want my choice, and I'd like more people to have choice like me.
5 states allow doctors to write prescriptions to help patients end their lives. 7 more have recently considered so-called death with dignity laws. But Maynard's case also brought out opposition.
Brain cancer sucks in a really big way.
Maggie Carner is fighting the same kind of brain cancer Maynard had. Another advocacy group posted this video before Maynard's death.
It's almost like you've stepped out on a ledge and you're ready to jump. I guess I'm yelling to you, Brittany, on your ledge. I'm asking you to stay with us as long as possible.
And some doctors have concerns too.
The patient has the autonomy to choose how they want to live or end their life. But to ask the physician to be complicit in an act of suicide, I think crosses a line.
Beyond inspiring heated debate, Maynard said her goals were simple.
And they mostly do boil down to my family and friends, and making sure they all know how important they are to me and how much I love them.
Maynard may have public opinion on her side. Gallup polls show a majority say doctors should be allowed by law to end a patient's life by some painless means if the patient asks. Whether that translates into legislation is a much more complicated political question, Brian.
She had brain cancer and it was spreading, and she had less than 6 months to live, and these incredibly increasing painful headaches were coming upon her. And when we hear stories like hers, we might wonder, well, what would we do in her position? And so I asked. I was getting my hair cut a few days ago, and want an opinion, ask the person who's cutting your hair, right? So I told my hair cutter what was going on and what I was going to be talking about with my colleague Ken Wyant here. We're sharing this time this morning, and others overheard our conversation. And soon 4 hair cutters were expressing their opinions on death with dignity. And if you wandered into the haircutting parlor at that moment, it might as well have had signage that read, Dr. Kevorkian's Close Shaves and Cuts. And the verdict was this: all of the women would have been supportive in any way of a friend or a relative who was terminally ill and made the decision to end his or her life. Conversely, none of them would choose to do it herself. Religious reasons. It was a sin to take your own life. 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill, means you too. About 15 years ago, a devout Presbyterian woman at the retirement home where I was moonlighting as a chaplain from my church in Hollywood sought me out, and she asked me this: would it be a sin if I stopped taking my medications? Clearly, they kept her alive, or she believed they did. And I told her that it wouldn't be, as I remember, best as I can remember a conversation that long ago, but it might be a bigger sin to not be the needed friend and positive influence on the people she lived and shared her life with every day. Perhaps she was needed by them. This is a hard one. I'm supposed to be here. Well, we made this decision. We were going to do this dialogue sermon, and I was going to take the pro side, and Ken was going to take the con side. And the more I unpacked the issues around this, the more difficult it became to understand. But as we talk together, I think we both agree that no one should suffer pain needlessly ever. We're working from a resolution today that went before our General Synod this summer called Aid in Dying. Brittany Maynard's husband, Dan Diaz, spoke on behalf of the resolution and as a promise to his dead wife, Brittany, that he would be an advocate for people like her so that no one should suffer terrible pain in their last months. And that's why it was so hard to watch the resolution fail by such a small handful of votes. I think it came down to 0.0-something% that it lost by. And if you're interested, look at our Facebook page when you go home and you can watch the whole discussion as it unfolded. It was extremely thoughtful. And the way people spoke to each other on the floor was incredibly gracious at every turn. But haven't many of us at one time or another walked beside a loved one as they began to transition out of this life? And it is such a privilege, and it's a privilege for me especially, to be with people on the journey. And when it is someone special and when it is someone who is loved, we become their advocates. It's harder when they are also suffering, and we can see that suffering, and we see it grow worse, and we just wish so much that we could take that suffering away. And I'm going to turn this over now to Ken for a few minutes, and perhaps he can start off with his thoughts about the resolution and the scriptural basis for it. Ken?
Paul, your haircut looks fine, but someone should have warned you not to go to Sweeney Todd's. This resolution before the General Synod last summer carried with it the scriptural reference in John 10:10 that we heard this morning. And they pulled that brief line, the second half of the verse about life more abundantly. And I was disappointed. It seemed to me to be ripped from its context in an odd way, and it is exactly the phrase from the Bible that the prosperity gospel advocates use to promote the idea that you and I, that Jesus wants for you and I all to be incredibly wealthy. And it just seemed to me to be the wrong verse. I want to raise this question because when someone in intense emotional and spiritual pain creates a situation where police officers have no choice but to shoot, we don't call it law enforcement assisted suicide. We call it suicide by cop. And first, I want to be sure there is no condemnation for anyone who ends their own life. No one else knows or completely understands what physical, emotional, or spiritual pain brings a person to choose to end their own life. The living, however, must deal with the aftermath. Many people who have been rescued from near suicide have gone on to express appreciation for continuing life. But those cases are not necessarily relevant to the present issue, which has to do with disease and injury, which physicians agree has no reasonable expectation of relief. It puts doctors in the position of facilitating the end of life. Some doctors see their role as relieving suffering rather than preserving life. But when death of a person is seen as relieving suffering, are we putting grandma in the same category as a horse with a broken leg? What suffering might we relieve by death? It's a delicate decision. And legally, there's disagreement about what constitutes death. There was a New Yorker article a month or so ago about the distinction between California's definition of death and New Jersey's definition of death. Again, today we're concerned with assisting suicide and not with pulling the plug kind of decisions. But the problem is in a similar category because of advanced medical directives signed long before the need to invoke them. The question of withholding treatment in full awareness that death will result is slightly different from the question of taking action that leads directly to death. Doctors themselves often decide to forego treatment. There's a famous essay, How Doctors Die, by Ken Murray, MD. Physicians have a unique perspective based on their training and experience. For me personally, the advanced medical directive that I have left goes like this. I don't want to die on Tuesday of something they can cure on Thursday. It's a slightly different way of saying what one of the General Synod delegates said. Why would we put a period where God puts a comma? Another delegate pointed out that we try to make things binary, a choice of one or the other, when in fact, God presents us with a spectrum. It would be a mistake to reduce this discussion to a binary decision where we must choose between forcing people to continue suffering or not. Paul, you and I are demonstrating that there is really a colorful spectrum, not just shades of gray, but a colorful spectrum of ideas to consider between the extremes. How long is it from Tuesday till Thursday? Back in the 90s, I managed a property that housed several HIV/AIDS patients. I vividly remember one such resident who was near death from that terrible disease. And a newly available cocktail of medication reversed the symptoms. By the miracle of medical science and research, that resident rose up from a deathbed and began to deal with the problems of how to live instead of how to die. How long is it from Tuesday to Thursday? A friend of mine died recently. He had multiple organ failure. And unlike the HIV/AIDS patients who received miraculous opportunity for life, the damage to my friend was irreversible, and he was no longer conscious. There was a frantic search for advanced medical directives that everyone was sure he had signed, but they couldn't be found. Only when his sister came to give the doctors permission to withhold heroic treatment did he rest in peace. Again, a pull the plug situation that is not quite identical with assisted suicide, where a lucid patient makes a decision to choose the time and manner of their own death. In our world of instant communication, we believe we know what potential treatments might be available by Thursday. I would want an extremely partisan advocate searching for potential treatments. But I recognize that the incidence of death among humans is still 100%. We are all terminal. Human bodies deteriorate beyond the potential for repair, and yet we know some people have arranged to cryogenically preserve their bodies, or at least their brains, in an effort to bridge the time from Tuesday until Thursday, even if it takes centuries to reach Thursday.
Ken, thank you. There's a couple of thoughts I had as I was reading what Ken was going to present, and after being in conversation together. So first, I want to disagree with one point on the comparison of physician-assisted suicide with suicide by cop. Our law enforcement sometimes gets put into an extremely unfair position of having to shoot and kill someone who has chosen to use this method of death. It's selfish, it is violent, and it no doubt places a psychic toll on the officer who gets put into this position. The physician, on the other hand, does not have to practice what he or she does not believe to be a good moral practice, and the person seeking him out is not running at him for a quick ending. In this way, these things are entirely different. However, some of your other points, as always, make me think further. And by the way, Reverend Ken Wyant leads our Bible study on Tuesday, and it's a growing group. He's fascinating. So come, I'm doing an advertising, aren't I? 4 o'clock on Tuesday. One of our speakers at General Synod is a woman pastor who has a life-threatening illness. It is a long-term terminal illness. She was depressed, and she was looking at her options of dying with dignity. And then she says her church community and her doctor all came around her. And while she is still ill, she was so grateful, she said, for the decision to live and to be present to tell her story. And of course, this is this individual and her story. Tuesday to Thursday. My best friend in New York City came back from dementia after AIDS had claimed him, after he had locked himself away and did not give us access to him. When the new drugs came just in time to turn his life around, that was a very dramatic Tuesday to Thursday. He lives with his husband in New York City today. Your example is right on.
Part of the resolution before the General Synod and discussion before legislatures considering this legal opportunity, work hard to resolve this issue. We want to ensure that anyone arriving at the decision to seek physician-assisted suicide would be free of undue influence in reaching their decision. We can't even sort out the influences of what makes people buy the things they buy. We could never sort out all the influences on a decision like this and parse them into reasonable versus undue influences. Why do advertisers advertise? In order to influence purchasing decisions. Why does anyone try to influence how people will vote in an election? What are the limits of persuasion? Do you remember Vance Packard's book, The Hidden Persuaders? It was published back in 1957. About advertising and the hidden ways advertising seeks to influence people. Do you think there have been no advances in persuasion science since then? Stakeholders in the decision to seek physician-assisted suicide extend beyond the patient themselves. They may include family, heirs, organ transplant brokers, healthcare managers with limited resources who can find additional income or enhance their outcome statistics by extending life. Insurance companies, medical insurance has an interest in reducing claims payments, whereas life insurance companies have an opposite interest in delaying the payment of death benefits, and on and on and on. What might those interests do to represent their interests in patients' decisions by influencing their decisions? And what are the social norms? We all live under the influence of social norms. I want you to call to mind some movies. Edward G. Robinson's last film, Soylent Green, Blade Runner. Need I say more? What about the Inuit, the Eskimos who legendarily put the elderly on an ice floe headed south? What about the old Native American in the movie Little Big Man? He climbs up on his platform to die, lies down, and after several hours of lying there, raindrops begin to fall on his cheek. He takes this as a sign and climbs down from the platform and says, "Sometimes the magic works, sometimes it doesn't." What about the next generation of people facing the decision of seeking physician-assisted suicide? It could get very crass in a hurry. Imagine this conversation. "Oh, Grandpa died over the weekend. It was so convenient. He scheduled it on Saturday, so no one had to miss work." We've seen a marked increase in scheduling cesarean births for convenience, why not deaths? Next generation ponders all the results, good and bad, and is influenced by the consequences they have experienced, just as we are influenced by those who came before us.
And here's where you make some good points. I want people to be able to have death with dignity. Is it suicide? Brittany Maynard's mother said, she didn't take her life. Her life was taken from her. She already had problems that she couldn't cure. She had a 6-month window that was filled with excruciating headaches that came on closer and closer. She said, this is not suicide. Suicide is a bad solution to a short-term problem, something that might have been resolved with help. And so again, have you been on a journey with someone you love who was dying? Were they suffering? And here's the area that's difficult, because it's wonderful to pass a law allowing someone you know and love not to suffer pain. The thing you have to consider, though, is over time and with multiple cases, does that result in the use of phrases like, I don't want to be a burden on my family? Do we begin to see pressure from insurance companies? Are there new thought processes that come into account in the desire on the part of people who are ill or infirm to feel selfish for wanting to stay alive, possibly not having as much to leave behind to their family as a result? How does this affect us? But here's where I would stand, and do stand, with the resolution on aid in dying, in its very limited 4 short sentences that read like this: that state by state in the, Washington, D.C., for an adult patient who, 1, has a medically diagnosed terminal illness or condition, 2, has a medical prognosis of death within 6 months, 3, is legally competent to make medical decisions, and 4, is expressing a voluntary and personal choice to die. With that, why don't you take the last word?
We have some difficult work to do before rendering an opinion on this topic. We need to sort out our understanding of what death means to us psychologically, socially, medically, and spiritually. Not so long ago, Christian theology had a clear and simple response to the issue of physician-assisted suicide. And it went like this: if you die by suicide, you cannot go to heaven. You cannot risk eternity in heaven to relieve some temporary suffering in this world. When we do away with orthodoxy, with those clear, simple theological rules, we take on difficult decisions. Maybe there is no heaven, so it doesn't really matter. But if there is a judgment, then we must depend on grace. If God forgives those who commit suicide or mass murder or working on the Sabbath or taking God's name in vain, then maybe I can sneak in with them. That's the only hope I've got.
Have we given you something to think about? In our Christian faith, there's an expression that goes something like this: We are given law and we are given grace. It's always best to think a little less law and a little more grace. And with that, let us stand in body or in spirit and sing our closing amen.